Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Hey, it's Maria Castaigne. I'm the lead producer of the Big Story podcast. From all of us here at Frequency Podcast Network, we just want to say happy holidays. We hope that you use this time to relax, spend time with loved ones, treat yourself if that's what you want, whatever helps you recharge. We have a really exciting lineup for you over the next couple of weeks here on the Big Story feed. It's called Friends of Frequency, and you're getting to meet all of the great hosts and shows that make our network so diverse. There's a little something for everyone, whether you like pop culture or music, health and wellness, self-improvement, news, current events, money, finances, you name it. We hope you enjoy our holiday episodes, and of course, if you like a certain episode, be sure to check out their show on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. Without further ado, we're kicking it off with the big story. Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for CityNews Cormac McSweeney and political correspondent Glen McGregor talk all things politics for 2025. I mean, looking back at the start of this year, it was a pretty active one. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we didn't really know what his political future looked like. We didn't really know if he was going to resign or prorogue Parliament. Ultimately, he did resign, and then there was the race to replace him. And, so many people threw their name in the hat. I don't really want to ruin the whole episode for you. Ultimately, it was Mark Carney who took over the Liberal Party, and then a federal election was triggered. All of this happening as U.S. President Trump started announcing tariffs and annexation threats on our country. It was a pretty busy year for Canadian politics. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's a two-part series. Part 1 starts right now.
I'm Cormac McSweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for CityNews, and I'm joined now by my colleague here in Ottawa, political reporter Glen McGregor. Glen, thanks very much for being here.
Pleasure to be here with you again, Cormac.
All right, we're talking about 2025. What a year did you expect everything that's happened in 2025 when we were ending off 2024?
No, and I think it's important to kind of think about where we were 1 year ago before Christmas, headed into what was going to be a period of reflection for Justin Trudeau. We knew that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives at that point were leading in the public opinion polls by anywhere between 20 and 25%. A Conservative majority government seemed almost a certainty. The Liberals had lost their deal with the NDP. There's confidence in supply agreement. They kept them in power for the 2 years previous. So it was looking very different than the situation we're facing right now. And I guess, kind of the first event of 2025 on the political calendar was Justin Trudeau, after that period of reflection, coming out and saying, yeah, he's going to resign. He either talked up enough colleagues, people close to him, his advisors, his staff, and decided that he just could not possibly continue because of, a month previous, Chrystia Freeland pulling the plug, announcing she was resigning as finance minister on the day she was supposed to deliver the fall economic statement. I know you were down there at what used to be Ottawa's City Hall where they tabled the budget documents, and I was still on Parliament Hill, and we were like, oh my God, this is crazy. I think you were down there. I think you had
No,
gone
I
down
was
to-
actually I was heading down there, and it was our colleague Xiao Li who came out and said, Freeland just resigned, and I thought it was a joke until I saw the tweet and the letter, and it was insane. But that was, I think, the catalyst after months and months of different MPs, slowly a growing group of MPs within the caucus who were saying it's time for a change in leadership.
Yeah, that's right. There's that whole drama inside the caucus, right? You had some MPs there was a letter circulated with the dozen plus names on it of people who were unhappy with his leadership, but very few of them were coming forward, right? There was a couple of MPs who'd come out, spoke publicly about it, but it wasn't until Freeland quit. I guess really that's probably like, maybe not by the calendar, but at least sort of like thematically was the first real event of 2025 politically was her decision to do that, because that set in motion a chain of events that we're now living with now, including Mark Carney being Prime Minister.
Yeah, and it was January 6th when Justin Trudeau resigned, right off the bat in the new year. And then immediately it seemed like the question was, who's going to run to replace him, not just as Liberal leader. He is still Prime Minister and the leader of the Liberals at the time, if they're sitting in the House of Commons or not, became the next Prime Minister. A hot ticket for sure. But there were some names already right off the bat that people were considering potentially to run, who came out of the woodwork. And people may forget there were some who decided to say they were going to run, and then they either got disqualified or they bowed out.
Right. And I mean, initially, the fact that Chrystia Freeland ran in that race, she was a close friend of Mark Carney's. And you combine that with the fact that her resignation as finance minister kind of set in motion the entire leadership race. There was some suggestion that possibly she was doing it out of self-interest. She really believed she could win this. Then Karina Gould decided she was going to run. I honestly didn't think, and I was totally wrong about this, I admit it now, I did not think there was any way Mark Carney was going to run, because we had heard Carney's name bandied about as a one-time future Liberal leader, one point a future prime minister. But those conversations have been happening for over 10 years. I mean, that's when I first heard this back during kind of like the early days of the Harper government, when the Liberals were cycling through leaders like Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff, and Bob Rae was in there for a while. That's when I started hearing his name. And then when Trudeau's leadership was being questioned, you started hearing about Carney. And I did kind of a deep dive looking into his sort of financial position at the time, and realized, why on earth would you want a job that's an incredible load on you, a really difficult job to do, no matter what people say about it. You're working all the time. You don't really get days off. Your privacy is gone. It's a nightmare job, and it pays, well, it's a pretty good salary. It's over $400,000, basically twice what an MP makes. But at the time, he was chairman of the board of Bloomberg International Media Company. We don't know, because they're not a publicly traded company. We don't have any oversight on how much he was making, but I would guess, conservatively, I would say, $5 million US in that role. Plus, he had the whole involvement with Brookfield Financial, which of course became a real issue in the early months of his term. But I just thought, there's no way this guy's going to do it. He's too wealthy. And then you had all these people coming out of left field, like you mentioned to me this morning. Remember Frank Baylis, who had been a Liberal MP in the Trudeau era, didn't run again, and he was a businessman. And I think I always remember about him is he had a business that he was making respirators, which sort of became an issue during the COVID crisis. And then suddenly he turns up. Honestly, I don't think I could have picked him out of a police lineup before he showed up on stage for the Liberal leadership debates. And I think he did really well. Like, people were very impressed by him.
Yeah, there were quite a few people who appreciated his stance on things. He took a sort of business approach as well, tried to be a bit more common sense. But, if you're running as the businessman candidate and you're up against Carney, it's kind of going to be a hard sell with the membership at that time. But we also had people like former BC Premier Christy Clark, who decided to toss her name out there before an interview with the CBC, where she claimed she wasn't a Conservative member. And that was quickly scuttled when the Conservatives put out a screen grab of her membership fees, and she had to backtrack that. And then shortly after, she was gone. But you had Chandra Arya as well, who was an PNMP. And
whose riding Carney later took after Arya was disqualified from running as a Liberal candidate 2 or 3 days before the writs dropped, and Carney decided he was going to run in that riding.
Yeah, and the issue with Arya, we never officially, from Arya himself, I don't think, or from the party, got the official reasons for the disqualification, but the party cited that they had a right to vet, and if through the vetting process they found that this person should not be the leader of the party, they could disqualify them. And there were reports about connections potentially to the Indian government, and being friendly with the Indian government at the time, which of course came just about a year or so after the allegations that India was involved in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil. So, that was obviously a big political risk if things got out. So they decided to say no. And Ruby Dahlia also tossed her name out there, and I think took part in the first debate, but was disqualified by the time the second and third debates took place. So a lot of people came out of the woodwork to try and run because, hey, it's the Prime Minister. You get an immediate elevation to Prime Minister without running in an election, although an election soon followed Mark Carney's tenure as Prime Minister. But before he did that, he had a little bit of business to do before he hit the polls.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he had to deal with all the sort of conflict of interest stuff that he was, found himself enmeshed in because of his extensive holdings. He had this long conversation with the federal ethics commissioner about how he could do this. The thing that really struck me, kind of looking back over the year and thinking about this time when Carney proved me completely wrong that he was going to run, and he came out and announced that he was running. The announcement that he was going to run for the leadership he held in Edmonton, Alberta, which surprised a lot of people because a lot of folks think of him as being kind of an Eastern, sort of Central Canadian type of thing, and forget that he was, originally born in Northwest Territories in Fort Smith, but grew up in Edmonton, spent his sort of formative years there, and that would become an issue during the campaign coming back. But he had that press conference that was terrible. Like, it just went really badly. And I was told that there was a problem with, when he came out to speak to the media and to make his announcement he was running, there's a problem with his teleprompter. And, you and I occasionally use teleprompters in our television work. We know if you're expecting to read off a teleprompter and your teleprompter fails, it is not a good feeling. You feel like you are completely lost. And he wasn't at that time an experienced enough politician to kind of run with it and go with it and speak off the cuff. It was just a bad event. Remember, there was somebody, we don't know who did this, but mischief makers sent a limousine to the event that he was at to pick him up, to kind of drive home this idea that he was, an elite, extremely wealthy, elite person. But I think, we could talk about this a little bit later, but over the course, since that time, in the months that followed leading up to the election, and then certainly from the election campaign, he became a much better retail politician. There was certainly some problems, including him snapping at journalists mostly.
Yeah,
in that thing, but he got much better at it. I think at least that was my impression.
Yeah, and I think the leadership run was a dry run for him before the election campaign. He had French issues he had to get over. There was that thing with saying the word Hamas, where he accidentally said that we agree with Hamas instead of saying we agree on the issue of Hamas. And, those are things that sometimes could matter. But at the time, I think the voter atmosphere around it, he kind of got what could have been a larger issue. They cut him some slack. And he just said, I made a mistake. I flubbed my French, which, to a lot of other politicians could be a larger issue. But he was getting a lot of leeway from the public at the time. But that in the end, that Liberal leadership was no contest. You would think that a former finance minister who did usher in this leadership race, but could actually have some sort of decent showing, especially since the rumors were that people like Freeland and then other names had been bandied about within a cabinet, had been working on potential leadership bids for years, waiting for the time that Trudeau would step aside, and then they would swoop in and try and take over that job. And yet, it was just, pardon my phrasing, but a bloodbath for Mark Carney in the end, because he dominated with, I believe, 85% of the vote.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to look at in terms of sort of an alternative history or a counter narrative. Had I been right, had Carney decided to stay in the well-paid corporate world that he had inhabited since he left the Bank of England, it might have been a different story, because Chrystia Freeland presumably would have been the front runner coming into that campaign. We don't know if François-Philippe Champagne or Dominic LeBlanc or other members of the cabinet might have decided to weigh in, but she was not particularly loved by her own caucus. This was something I heard even before she resigned as finance minister. I heard a lot of grumblings from Liberal MPs who said, we can't really get behind Chrystia, and she was an issue for them. So, and I think that was maybe reflected in some of those numbers you're talking about in the leadership race.
We talk about where we were a year ago. I think it was the Liberals were polling at something like 15% nationally. And for a governing party, it boggles your mind about how low they got in public support at that time, because that doesn't often happen that they would reach those kinds of lows. And so she had, being by his side, deputy minister through most of his tenure, or holding these key roles through all of his tenure since 2015, it was hard for her to shake that image. And I think the party membership really wanted a fresh start. And I guess they had that with Mark Carney being sort of that outsider. And, those flubs that he's had kind of goes back to that idea of him being an outsider. I'm not the politician. I'm a business guy. I'm a bit different. I've got things to learn. And they were able to lean into that, which probably allowed for him to get through some of those issues in the early start. But, he won soundly, and then we were right into a federal election in which, as you had pointed out earlier, it had seemed just months before that the Conservatives were going to walk right into power, and everything had flipped by the time I believe it was April 28th when we had the vote, but earlier when the trip to Rideau Hall came and Mark Carney asked the Governor General for an election.
Yeah, the thing I remember about in that election it was really kind of uneventful other than that sort of central fact. I mean, by the time the writs dropped and Carney went to Rideau Hall for, I think, the second time, and I don't know how many, was within under a month anyway, because he'd been there to swear in his first cabinet after he'd won the leadership. Then he comes back to Rideau Hall, and I remember that being a cold, sunny day, but cold day. And I remember being cold for the next 36 days of the election campaign. It was freezing. The spring election campaign we thought was going to be so nice to be out traveling around the country, seeing folks. And it kind of, not a lot happened. I mean, but at the beginning of the election, I can't remember the exact figures in the polls, but certainly the Liberals and Carney had a lead, or at least had substantially eroded the Poilievre's lead. And it didn't really change a whole lot until election night. I mean, Carney, it was his first time running an election campaign. Certainly there were lots of little missteps, little blunders, but I don't think of there being any kind of pivotal event that changed the direction of that campaign. And which is interesting because the three previous election campaigns, Justin Trudeau had in each of those come from behind. He had changed, even when he was an incumbent. He had come from behind if you go by what the public opinion polling was showing. So there was, a dynamic quality to those previous campaigns. This one was kind of static throughout. There wasn't a whole lot of variation. There wasn't any, we didn't get a lot. I mean, there's some of them. We didn't get a lot of those bozo eruptions where a candidate has to resign for, peeing in a coffee cup, for example, to cite a previous case.
Which for our listeners did actually happen. That was an issue with a Conservative candidate, I believe. Yeah.
That's right. Was caught on a video doing a renovation in somebody's kitchen and decided to, All right. Nevertheless, there wasn't anything like that, unfortunately, because we love stories like that as journalists, because people can talk about it and dig in and it generates interest. Didn't have a lot of those. And the debates didn't really seem to change the direction of it either.
No, because it was interesting because Carney was still, finding his feet as a politician. Pierre Poilievre was trying to pull back a bit during the debates after he started that campaign, the Conservative leader, with criticisms that he didn't pivot to Trump, because this really was the Trump election. Who was best to deal with the United States? Who do we want sitting in that chair across from Trump at the White House negotiating a trade deal? And there were criticisms from the Conservatives' own central figures like Corey Tenike, who had run previous campaigns for the Conservatives, but he was with Premier Doug Ford and has been helping Ford out. And he was vocal in his criticism, saying that Poilievre wouldn't pivot, and he's falling on his face, and he's losing this election because he's just still fighting the Trudeau election. Those were the criticisms from Corey Tenike. And so Poilievre tried to take a different tact, I think, with the debate, not be his regular self in the House of Commons. And so that ended up with the debate kind of seeming a bit boring in the end when we look back at it compared to some other previous debates where you really see a lot of fire amongst the leaders to try and get an edge in the polls.
Yeah, and you're still hearing Conservatives kind of conducting an autopsy of what went wrong, not just in the campaign, but leading up to it. And it does come down to that he was unable or unwilling to adapt to this new narrative that began really when Trump was elected in November of last year, and then really kicked into high gear with the inauguration. And of course, Carney had met him, right, as Prime Minister, that first visit to the Oval Office. And remember that there was a lot of concern that from the Prime Minister's office, people speaking privately would say they were worried about how this was going to go, because of how it had gone for the Ukraine's President Zelensky. in his visit to the Oval Office, I think it was in February, I'm going by memory here, and then Carney came down at some point later to meet with him, and there was a real worry that Trump was going to turn on Carney and embarrass him in front of the world's media in the Oval Office, and he kind of got through it okay. Remember, he had that line that he used with Trump about Canada. You know, I've talked. Actually, it was just right after the election campaign, wasn't it? I'm thinking about it now because that was the line that he used with Trump, was that I've spoken to the owners of Canada and it's not for sale, right? And referring to the fact he had done this, extensive consultation of being an election campaign. So he got through that okay. But on the campaign front, the inability of Poilievre to kind of adjust, not just on policy issues, recognizing that Trump and the tariffs and the threats of annexation were the top issue for so many Canadians in that election, but also not changing his personal style, because he was running and planning to run a front-runner campaign, quite rightly, having looked at the polls, said all I need to do is just keep everything on lockdown for 36 days. We're just going to get through it. We're not going to invite the media on our airplanes for the first time, I mean, really in modern election history, at least since the first time since leaders have been traveling by airplane, that a major party leader decided not to allow journalists to buy tickets and pay their way onto his airplane in order to cover him better. So we had to kind of scramble around getting to events. And I was like flying commercial all over the place, driving, around Southern Ontario. I remember one day driving from St. Catharines, where Poilievre had an event, down to Windsor, Ontario. We had another big rally event. And they, I think I went to 7 separate press conferences Poilievre had during that campaign, because I was trying to mix in my coverage of doing that with covering the Liberal campaign. The Liberals did have a plane. It was a lot easier campaign to cover logistically. You could be with the leader all the time. You had way better access. And also Carney, unlike Poilievre, would take multiple questions from journalists. Poilievre's campaign was so locked down, they would decide only which 4 journalists traveling with him would be allowed to ask questions. And they would only take questions. Generally, we found they were favoring. I mean, occasionally CBC would get a question, or Radio-Canada would get a question. Occasionally, they were really kind of seemed to favoring sort of alternative media or more conservative media. Places like the Rebel, suddenly they are now participating in these things. I went to 7 of those press conferences, and every time asked if I could ask a question of the person who wanted to be prime minister, and every time was told no. Now, maybe he doesn't like me. I don't care. It's it's not my ego that's on the line here. It's my job to ask questions on behalf of our listeners and viewers, and put them to Poilievre. And we weren't able to do that, so he never pivoted from that. And I think that was, I'm speaking here out of my own self-interest to an extent, because I think journalists should be allowed to ask questions of political leaders. I don't think that's a wild idea, but obviously not a view that he shared.
And just before we go here, I did want to talk about the results of the election, because Mark Carney increased the Liberal seat count to 169, just shy of a majority. And I remember election night being at the Liberal camp and speaking to some Liberal staffers who, when I said, are you upset that you fell just shy of the majority? And they said, given how the state we were in just 6 months ago, I'm really happy right now, because we thought we were done for. So the Liberals coming in with a minority government, but just shy of a majority, raising 17 seats. The Conservatives, though, to stick with that, 144 seats. They increased by 24 seats in that election, and yet Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre lost his seat. We saw NDP leader Jagmeet Singh lose his seat in Burnaby. Seeing 2 leaders knocked out like that of major parties, especially the official opposition, doesn't happen too often. So what did you think of the election night results?
Yeah, I think a little bit of copium there being expressed by Liberals. Liberals thought they were on their way to a majority and thought they were going to get it. And the election night results were the one sort of surprising thing I thought. I thought the Liberal plurality, that is the number of seats by which they won, was going to be much higher. And I remember sitting there at the TD Place at the hockey rink where the women's hockey team plays here in Ottawa, where the Liberals had their convention, thinking, wow, this is surprising. The Conservatives are doing very well. I think, though, you can't take, I've heard the figure that a lot of Conservatives have used, saying this was their best result in the election campaign since Brian Mulroney, if you go by number of seats and popular vote. The difference, though, is the complete collapse of the NDP in this case, because New Democrat voters, quite obviously, didn't want a Poilievre government and also felt Carney was the best person. So they abandoned, substantial numbers of voters abandoned the NDP. Some of them went to the Conservatives. Some of them went to the Liberals. And the result was both those parties had much higher vote counts as a share of the popular vote, and also higher seat counts. But I think, if you think the next election, if the NDP can kind of resurrect itself, that's probably unlikely to be replicated. But yeah, obviously, huge surprise. You have two party leaders losing their seats. I don't think that's ever happened. Jagmeet Singh lost his seat in Burnaby, and Pierre Poilievre in the riding of Carleton. So that was a shock. And I honestly didn't think after that night we saw that Poilievre had lost, I didn't think he was going to be able to survive as leader, because I think most leaders in that situation would resign, but he chose not to. And now we're going to find out in January whether or not that was the right decision.
Yeah, and Singh did resign. Just for our listeners, the NDP were reduced to 7 seats after going into the election with 24 seats. So the worst showing for the NDP in the party's history. So this is a two-parter of our federal year in review, and yet the first part only brings us to April 28th. So a lot more to talk about in the next episode coming up. Have a listen.